Let me introduce the first two speakers. Alisa Herodes comes from the Judith Basin area and is in the heart of Montana. She is currently serving on the Tribal Council for the Little Shell Tribe of Chippewa Indians. In 2014, Alisa started a fundraising for a memorial dedicated to the Métis in Montana, and those efforts came to fruition in 2023 with a monument placed at the Cavalry Cemetery in Lewistown. And then, of course, there's Ken Robison, who serves as historian at the Overholser Historical Research Center in Fort Benton, as well as on the Great Falls Cascade County Historic Preservation Commission and the Sun Valley Historical Society. Ken is also a member of the Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees and a past recipient of the Society's Heritage Keeper Award. He is also the author or co-author of 16 books. So, without any further ado, let's hear from Alisa and Ken.
Well, good morning, everyone. Great to have you here. We're expecting Al Wiseman. Is he in the audience yet? And if Al Wiseman comes, oh, here he is. Al, come on up. At the end of our talk, I'll be introducing a couple of Montana's greatest Métis. In the meantime, you'll have to put up with this white guy and this wonderful Alisa Herodes, member of the Little Shell. So imagine a nation that was biracial, multilingual, bicultural, multicultural, with its own language. This nation had a distinct mode of dress, cuisine, architecture, with its own colorful music and dance. It designed its own transport vehicles and herded cattle while it hunted buffalo. From the early 1880s, it had a quasi-military organization, its own flag, which is up here, and was self-governing. It was a nation rich in folklore and national identity. I guess I don't have to tell you that's the Métis of North America. Well, while the slide is changing. So who are the Métis? Let's begin with the vast territory comprising 1/3 of today's Canada. For 200 years, from 1670 until 1870, it was the exclusive commercial domain of the Hudson Bay Company. Named for Prince Rupert, British King Charles II's cousin and first governor of the Hudson Bay Company, the company had exclusive rights to trade and colonize the entire Hudson Bay drainage from the heart of the continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains, from the prairies to the Arctic Circle. The Hudson Bay Company established forts and trading routes throughout Cree, Assiniboine, and other indigenous territory. These indigenous groups took part in the growing trading economy, and some were even employed by the Hudson Bay Company. They trapped beaver in exchange for trade goods. The Scott, French, and English workers, the voyageurs or engagés of the Hudson Bay Company and rival Northwest Company, mixed with the Cree and other indigenous peoples. The success of the fur trade relied on intermarriage, and the mixed descent children developed a sense of themselves as a unique social and cultural community. Meanwhile, the fur trade was evolving into the bison robe trade, and the Métis became renowned buffalo hunters. Rupert's Land became home to the new nation of mixed or Métis people. This Métis nation formed a community with a homeland in the 3 Canadian prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The Red River Valley, centered around today's Winnipeg, became home of 2 prominent settlement communities of mixed descent people. The sizable French-speaking and nominally Catholic Métis residents and a group of English-speaking biracial Anglican agriculturalists. Today's meaning of Métis includes both those French and English heritage interrelated communities, and today's Canadian law under the Constitution Act of 1982 recognizes three Indian, Inuit, and Métis people as the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. But let's return to the days of Rupert Land, and the Métis Nation emerged as a political force in the 19th century, radiating outward from the Red River settlement. By the 1821, the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company had merged, and the Métis settlement grew. Britain formed the Dominion of Canada in 1867, and Rupert's Land, that 200-year charter, expired, and this vast land was transferred to the new Canadian government. Métis leaders rejected the notion that this transfer was possible without the consent of the Indigenous Métis National Committee or the people that lived there. Armed conflict known as the Red River Resistance followed with a Métis National Committee and a provisional government. And that government formed under a most charismatic leader, Riel. Initial successes led to the establishment of Manitoba as a province and several commitments to protect Métis landholdings, Métis language, and local political control. Regrettably for the Métis, the Canadian government didn't keep these agreements. They were never properly implemented. Canadian settlers and troops arriving were generally hostile to the Métis. As a result, of the 10,000 or so Métis there in 1870, at least 2/3 departed in the years that followed. Heading west to establish Métis communities, while some came south across the unmarked border, the Medicine Line, mostly into Montana Territory. I should emphasize that some Métis already had settled in the new Montana Territory, but the failed 1870 Red River resistance led to Métis settlements in Montana around Spring Creek at what became Lewistown and the South Fork of the Teton west of today's town of Choteau, with other Métis following the dwindling herds of bison in the Milk River and Missouri River Badlands. It also brought leader Louis Riel to Montana Territory, and more about him later. Huntley Brinkley.
Hi there. It looks like I have to make up some time. And pretty appropriate. We're starting in the Northwest Territories and we're here in the Canadian room. So, so Ken kind of discussed about who the Métis were and where they started, and as they came down through the Medicine Line, marrying the women of the region, the Cree, the Saltano, the Chippewa, and then blended their own culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about Métis dress, and they wore clothing pretty similar to everybody else. There's a couple of items that made them distinct, like the capote, this wool hooded coat made out of a point blanket from the Hudson Bay Company. And the other one is the Métis sash. This is the quintessential Métis sash. You could really spot a Métis person by that. Is that right here, the meanings of the colors there. And of course, Charlie Russell, who was key last night. If anybody knows where Charlie Russell got that sash, I'd love to hear that story. Yes, this 6x9 wool sash was worn around the waist and had many uses, whether it was a towel, a harness, a saddle blanket, a sewing kit off the ends. This here is an example of some Métis beadwork. They're known as the flower beadwork people, the Métis. And it's typically like a lot of the Plains Indians, other than the Cree, very geometric in design. The Métis have two flags. there's a red and a blue, and I've heard so many stories that the blue is for Northwest Territories and the red is the Hudson Bay. And then I've also heard that the blue is in times of peace, and then they show the red in times of war. And honestly, I also heard that they used the color they had. So it's really hard to say. But what I do know about this flag is it predates the Canadian maple leaf by 150 years. Skipped a little too far forward. Music. Definitely the music can be described as First Nation, Scottish, and French Canadian fiddle, but a very unique Métis style. And just like the music, the Métis dance is a blend of Native and Celtic styles. And the quintessential Métis music is the Red River Jig. It's like the unofficial anthem for the Métis people. If you want to drive a Métis crazy, nail the moccasins to the floor and play the Red River Jig. And to get an idea of what the Métis dance looks like, it's a picture like powwow fancy step having a baby with Celtic highline dancing, basically. So, food, buffalo, bannock, and bullets. So you cannot talk about the Métis without talking about the buffalo, because they were definitely buffalo people. And another staple was bannock. And if you're from Montana, you know what bannock is, you know, that long shelf life, heavy, dense bread. And it was easy to take with you, just tuck it in the folds of your Métis sash and take it with you. It was great. And bullets are not ammunition, they're nutrition. Le boulet is a meatball style soup. And families pass down these recipes from generation to generation. And if I know anything about the Métis people, they all say they made it the correct way. And every family says that. But the Métis or the Little Shell, they make do with what they had. So their recipes, you know, it's just fine, whatever they had available. I grew up eating bullet soup, and it was in my 20s before I realized it was even a cultural meal. Language. So the Métis spoke at least 4 languages, as well as the plain sign language, native sign language. And they have their own language called Michif. The language is predominantly a mix of Cree, French, and Chippewa. And it definitely gave them an upper hand in the trade world. Like to say hello is Tanshe, and goodbye is Minakawapa just to get a sound of what they sound like. Transportation, their mode of transportation was a Red River cart. You could hear them long before you could see them. There's going to be a slide later that Ken shows that you can see a picture of it. The beliefs, of course, predominantly Catholic, and they were educated. Of course, you know, you got to be able to read that Bible. So they prayed before their buffalo hunts, and the priests accompanying them on their hunts also. When I was young, my grandmother told me that she was rounded up and sent to St. Peter's Mission, which is in Cascade. And I was like, that's not true, Grandma. You had to go to school. That's not really the way it is. This is a picture of my great-grandfather's Chippewa Bible. And there is a photo of my grandmother's school book from St. Peter's Mission, as well as a postcard from one cousin to the other. And it actually says off to the side, the happy days we had here, which is conflicting with some of the stories I had heard. And then just to finish, there's my grandma's the second to the left, but just a picture of the Berger children. So my family is Berger and Laframboise.
No figure in Canadian history is more controversial than the eloquent, brilliant, mystical Métis leader Louis Riel, and Montana shares his powerful tale. A hero in the eyes of his people and the French Canadians, a villain in the eyes of many English Canadians. Louis Riel spent 5 years from 1879 to 1884 in exile in Montana Territory, centered on Fort Benton. Riel was exiled for leading the Red River resistance. In 1879, Riel and many of the Métis moved to the valleys of the upper Missouri to hunt the increasingly scarce bison. There he became a trader and interpreter. As his people wandered the turbulent Montana frontier, demoralized and enduring economic hardship, as Riel observed the effects of alcohol and the problems of his people, he became a forceful activist in Montana politics as he tried to suppress the alcohol trade and create a reserve for the Métis in northern Montana. Perhaps the best introduction to this marvelous individual is that of Martha Edgerton Rolfe and her description of first meeting with him in Fort Benton. Of course, most of you know Martha or Mattie was the daughter of Montana's first territorial governor, Sidney Edgerton, and her knowledge of Montana pioneers was unsurpassed. In Martha's words, quote, "One evening at sunset in the summer of 1883, someone knocked at the door of our home in Fort Benton, situated on a hill above town and near the stage road. I opened the door to find a man standing there dressed like a hunter, possibly a rancher. He inquired if my husband was home, and I told him, no, but I expect him at any moment, and added, will you please come in and wait for him? He accepted the invitation and entered the house. I saw that he was a medium height, light complexioned, with hair a reddish color, according to my recollection. He had blue eyes. His nose was his most prominent feature, being of good length and aquiline, the nose of a leader. He was scarcely seated before Mr. Rolfe arrived, and at once introduced the stranger as Louis Riel. The name meant nothing to me at that time, except it had a foreign sound, and I thought him to be a Frenchman. He was in some difficulty with the authorities at Fort Benton, and Mr. Rolfe acted as his attorney. After discussion of business, the conversation turned to the other subjects, and for a couple of hours, Riel held us spellbound by the narration of his experiences in Montana. He had a wonderful voice for speaking, strong and with a resonance I never heard equaled. At one town where he and his people were encamped, one of the county officials, without the slightest show of legality, charged into their midst and drove off their finest horses to add to his large herd. His people were helpless. It was useless for them to appeal to the authorities. They were breeds. With no rights, a white man was bound to respect. All they could do was to submit in silence to this outrage. This was but one of the many stories he narrated. Over to you, Alisa.
Oh, wow. Due to the depleting buffalo herds and unrest up north, Métis traveled to Montana. They settled in Augusta, Choteau, Lewistown, as well as Helena and other areas. The 25 Métis families that settled in Lewistown in 1879 were led by Pierre Berger. That's Pierre here and his wife Judith Wilkie Berger. They lived along Spring Creek for several years until the land was purchased by Jacob Corbley in 1894. Corbley noticed some graves on his land, and he notified the priest at St. Leo's, Father Van de Hovel, that he'd be running sheep on the land. And he went to his Métis friends, and the father went to his Métis friends and said, you know, they decided to exhume the bodies and rebury them in consecrated ground that in 1891 was donated by a Métis family, the Willettes, for the purposes of a burying ground. While the men were busy digging up the remains, another group was making coffins and readying them for reburial. When I first heard this story, I was like, oh, that's just kind of Métis folklore talking about a mass grave. Well, the real word is mass reburial, but and then I heard it from somebody else, and I decided, okay, let's do a little digging into this. And it wasn't that tough to find because people already knew this story. It just took time to get to some of us. This is a 2-sentence paragraph talking about the half-breeds being dug up and reburied. Shortly after finding this article, I came across a story written by Elizabeth Swan, who's actually my grandmother's cousin. It talks about the Métis trek to the Lewistown area. She wrote about the first Spring Creek death, a missing child, as well as the mass reburial. Her account describes steps taken and care taken by the Métis to honor their loved ones, including a 2-day requiem mass down the halls of St. Leo's. Now, if you're picturing that beautiful church, that wasn't built till 1916, so this was an actual wooden structure that resembled a home. Another family photo. When I was showing the old part of Calvary Cemetery where the reburial was to go, or was, there was no proof of the history lying underneath my feet. I can imagine there was probably once grave markers, but over 130 years, harsh Montana environment, you know, they were no longer there. So this story needed to be told. So a letter was written to St. Leo's Church to ask permission and to place a large headstone to commemorate the original settlers of Lewistown. And we started raising money. It took 9 years, but we did it. Ground penetrating radar was done. You can see the flags here. Those are the different burials that are unmarked. There's like 32 of them right there. Then the unveiling was actually done on September 2nd, 2023. Chris Latreille here is one of the speakers at it. There was about 72 people interred, but so far we only have half the names. So hopefully we can fill up the other side of that monument. In her recorded story, Elizabeth and the woman listed as Mrs. She had listed the women as like by their husbands' names. Mrs. Francois Lavender, Mrs. You get the picture. We wanted to make sure these women had their identities. So we had to do a little digging to find out what are their first names and what are their maiden names. And some were easy to find, like Mrs. Gabrielle Dumont, we knew who she was. But we had trouble, like Mrs. John Baptiste LaFountain. I even called my Fountain friends in Lewistown and they didn't know who she was. And it was 2 days before we actually engraved the travertine that we got her name, and I about cried, so. This is actually a LaFountain family showing their names here. That's from the News Argus. And then there's the memorial there. One of the people here, when I talk about Madeline Dumont and why was she important? Well, she was the sister of Judith Wilkie Berger, who's one of the founders. And she was also the wife of Gabrielle Dumont. And Gabrielle Dumont was the military commander for Louis Riel.
Being exiled from Canada, Louis Riel was living in Montana Territory. In 1880, Louis Riel's Montana agenda became clear when he filed for citizenship, petitioned for a Métis reserve, and became involved in Montana politics with some powerful Republican allies like Wilbur Sanders and Alexander Botkin. And I'll briefly pass by his attempt to, through a petition, to gain a reserve for the Métis, and the fact that after visiting Miles City looking for a settlement area, he settled in St. Peter's Mission. His family and his finances dictated that he settle down. So in this amazing complex in the mountains that was St. Peter's Mission and the Ursuline, he began teaching at a new boys' school for the Jesuits. While he was there, he, on June 4th, 1884, while he was attending Mass at the mission, 4 Métis leaders from Saskatchewan, led by Gabrielle Dumont, arrived to recruit Riel to lead them in a new campaign to address their grievances against Canada. Returning to Canada, Riel held a series of meetings that turned from loyal agitation into rebellion at the Red River settlement. In this aftermath, Riel was tried and hanged. And Dumont and many of his followers crossed that medicine line into exile in Montana Territory again. Allies, including Chief Little Bear and the Cree, also crossed the medicine line to become part of the landless Indians of Montana. Today, Louis Riel has become a national hero in Canada. In the words of Manitoba scholar Dr. B.H. Dobbs, Louis Riel was far from being a bloody revolutionary, but rather, quote, a saintly idealist, a 19th century forerunner of Gandhi. As historian at the Overholser Research Center in Fort Benton, I frequently research Métis families. Last couple of weeks ago, the Belcourt family that came from Canada to ranch around Choteau. While I was researching Montana and our participation in World War I discovered the remarkable story of Louise Lafournier from a Canadian Métis family. Louise became one of two native Indian nurses to serve in World War I from Montana, although she's been overlooked because she wasn't a member of, quote, a registered federal tribe. According to Nicholas Roman, today Louise would be a member of the Little Shell of Chippewa. She was born in Manitoba, moved with her family to the Opime area. Somehow she graduated in nursing and also proved up a homestead north of Opime before entering the Army as a Red Cross nurse. And there were many other stories we could share, but time. And you had some more.
Just one quick thing. Yeah. So just last. If you're interested in learning more about the Métis culture, every June, the Michif Heritage Keepers hold a celebration in Choteau. And Lewistown also has a Métis celebration in Powwow, and that's during Labor Day weekend. So I invite you all to come. And the story of the Lewistown Spring Creek Métis band may have been lost forever if Elizabeth Swan had not written down her story. And the founders of Lewistown would have been left to a two-sentence paragraph in the News Argus. So if you take anything away from this talk, take the importance of telling your story, write it down. It will be a gift to your descendants. You never know, in 100 years, somebody might be at the Montana History Conference talking about you.